All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going on a seriously fascinating historical journey. We are unpacking the deeply complex and honestly often misunderstood history of how the Quran was actually preserved. We're going to separate academic reality from some pretty common public misconceptions, and we'll be drawing directly from traditional scholarship and modern textual criticism to do it. It's kind of like a gripping historical detective story, so let's get started.
So, let me ask you a quick question to kick things off. Is the Quran exactly the same, letter for letter, dot for dot, in every single physical copy ever made since its inception? Now, if you answered yes, you are definitely not alone. But as we're about to see, the historical and academic reality is far more layered, nuanced, and frankly incredibly interesting than just a simple yes.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the uniformity myth. Second, first-century manuscripts. Third, the 7 revealed modes. Fourth, the Athamic standardization. And fifth, the power of orality.
All right, part 1, the uniformity myth. You know, there's this really widespread misconception out there that has caused a lot of confusion, especially when modern historical critics start examining ancient texts. Many well-meaning folks have pushed this narrative to the lay public that the Quran is a strictly uniformic text, meaning they think it's had absolutely zero textual or recitational variations from the very beginning. But traditional Islamic scholars and academic historians, they know this just isn't historically accurate. The traditional reality is that the Quran is actually a multiformic text. It was specifically designed with authorized recitational variations. It was literally never meant to be rigidly uniform in the way people assume today.
Moving on to part 2, first-century manuscripts.
Okay, so if the text wasn't strictly uniform, how well is it actually tested in history? Let's look at the physical evidence. When textual scholars try to date an ancient manuscript, they rely on a pretty rigorous 3-step framework. First is paleography. That's the study of how the letters are actually shaped. Second is orthography, which looks at ancient spelling conventions, like how words were spelled in a very specific era. And third, of course, is radiocarbon dating, which gives us scientific age estimates for carbon-based materials like parchment.
To really understand the strength of the Quran's physical preservation, it kind of helps to look at a comparative baseline. According to textual scholars, if we look at the New Testament, a text originating in the early 1st century CE, exactly 0% of it is attested in extant physical manuscripts from its 1st century. The absolute oldest fragment we have is about the size of a credit card, and it dates to decades after that 1st century closed.
Now contrast that directly with the Quran. Based on modern scientific testing, including discoveries like the famous Birmingham manuscript, which actually dates to within 13 years of the Prophet Muhammad's death, an astonishing 96 to 100% of the Quran is attested in extant manuscripts from the 1st Islamic century. Leading textual scholars confirm that the entirety of the standardized text is physically accounted for in this very 1st century.
Which brings us to section 3, the 7 revealed modes.
So, if the text is perfectly preserved physically, why did we say earlier that it was multiformic with variations? Well, traditional sources record that the Prophet Muhammad stated the Quran was revealed in 7 modes, or ahruf. Listen, these were not accidental scribal errors made centuries later, not at all. They were deliberate, authorized categories of recitational variation that originated from the Prophet himself, and the purpose, it was twofold. First, to make the recitation a lot easier for various Arab tribes who had different dialects, and second, to deeply enrich the theological meaning of the text.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how these modes work. Take the famous opening chapter, Al-Fatiha. The Prophet authorized reciting a specific word as either Malik, meaning king, or Malik, meaning owner. Think about it. A king rules a kingdom and sets the laws, right? But he doesn't own the pizza in your fridge. An owner, on the other hand, owns his house, but he doesn't set the laws of the land. By allowing the word to be recited both ways, the text actually expands its meaning. God is simultaneously the king who rules and the owner who possesses everything. Like I said, it's a feature, not a bug.
All right, part 4, the Uthmanic standardization.
As Islam rapidly expanded across the world, these variations began to cause some friction among new converts who just hadn't been taught about the 7 modes. So here's how the timeline played out to solve that issue. The Prophet recited the Quran for 23 years. After he passed, his close companions went off to different regions, taking their personal handwritten codices with them. But to quell the rising regional unrest over the different recitations, the Caliph Uthman formed a master committee around 650 CE led by Zayed. This committee brought all those companion codices together to collate and standardize what became the Master Uthmanic Codex.
Now we need to take a quick, really vital detour here. What actually happened to those early, pre-standardization companion codices? Well, to make just one book of parchment back then took the skins of about 300 animals. It was wildly expensive, so scribes frequently used palimpsests. Basically, they'd take an older manuscript, scrape off or erase the ink, and write the new standardized text right over it. Fast forward to 1972, in Sana'a, Yemen, researchers discovered exactly this: a Quran manuscript with an erased lower text that represents one of these early non-standardized companion codices. It's a massive discovery.
So the crucial point here is this: when academics use ultraviolet light to read that erased Sana'a undertext, they absolutely do find differences from the standardized Uthmanic text, but traditional scholarship easily accounts for these. The differences really just boil down to four things: orthography, which is just different dialectical spelling habits; aruf, those authorized revealed variations we already talked about; simple scribal memory errors, human slips; and exegetical notes, meaning the companion was literally writing their own personal study notes in the margins, and those are never meant to be part of the official text anyway.
Some modern critics really hoped the Sana'a manuscript would reveal some wildly different, completely alternate Quran, but it didn't. In fact, after the most rigorous academic study of the palimpsest, Dr. Benham Sadeghi concluded that the standard Uthmanic version remains the absolute most faithful representation of the Quran as recited by the Prophet. Zayd's committee back in 650 CE did an impeccably accurate job of capturing the authentic text.
And finally, Section 5, the power of orality.
So, how did the text survive so perfectly after Uthman sent out his standardized copies? Well, let's look at a fascinating historical fact. Uthman's official master codices were sent out without dots and without vowels. Why? Orientalists used to claim it was just because the Arabs hadn't invented them yet, and that readers were just free to guess what the words meant. That is completely false. The lack of dots was a highly intentional feature. It allowed those authorized aruf variations to be physically plugged into the text by the master reciter who accompanied the book. The physical manuscript was really just a memory aid. It was heavily constrained by strict oral transmission.
And this perfectly illustrates the sheer power of that oral tradition. Take the famous opening verse of chapter 36, Yasin. In the early dotless manuscripts, the skeletal shape of those letters could theoretically be pronounced in 9 different ways. It could be Tashin, Nashin, Bashin, you name it. Yet, if reciters were just freely guessing the vowels and dots, we'd have thousands of wild variations today. But every single canonical reading tradition across the globe universally recites it as Yasin. Why? Because they couldn't just invent readings. They were strictly bound by the living oral sunnah of the Prophet.
This brings us to the concept of mutawatir. This is an incredibly important term to understand. It means a text that is mass transmitted by vast groups of reciters across multiple generations, with totally unbroken chains of transmission. The preservation of the Quran was never truly about the parchment or the ink, it was always about the mutawatir oral chains. Millions of people memorizing, reciting, and passing down the exact sounds, generation after generation, providing absolute certainty.
Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to end on today. As we've seen, while the manuscript evidence for the Quran is astonishingly robust, manuscripts can be erased, they can burn, they lack vowels. So, does the true preservation of an ancient text lie merely in the fragile ink on a page, or does it ultimately live in the unbroken, living chain of the voices that recite it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.